Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Book Bites. This is a series, I think we're now in the seventh installment of the series, and it's an opportunity for readers and writers to make contact. My name is John Gurda, and I've been working in the field of Milwaukee history for the last just a little over 48 years. Began this back in 1972. I've written 23 books, including two for the Society. The Society also distributes two books that are probably the ones that are better known. One's called The Making of Milwaukee, which is a general history of Milwaukee. The first one published since 1948 is now in its fourth edition, which came out back in 2018, published by the Milwaukee County Historical Society, which has a partnership with WHS. And the other one is kind of a geographic companion to The Making of Milwaukee called Milwaukee City of Neighborhoods, published by Historic Milwaukee Incorporated. And that's kind of a grassroots encyclopedia of Milwaukee neighborhoods, 37 of them, based on a series of posters done by the city of Milwaukee back in the 1980s. Very colorful, just wonderful pieces of art. But the two books I've done for the Society, one is called Milwaukee, a City Built on Water, that came out back in 2018. And it's kind of an unusual origin story. It began as a lecture series, turned into a PBS documentary, and then became a book. So it's kind of a rather not the usual way you get into print. And it's basically a look at the role that water has played in Milwaukee and what Milwaukee has done to and with water over the decades, from the years of native settlement to the recent past. So chapters on recreation at the time when the upper Milwaukee River was pretty much in town up north, when people couldn't get all the way up north for water recreation in the summer months. And industry and certainly pollution. The Milwaukee River was an open sewer at one time, and talking about remediation as well. Some of there are 2 pages of descriptions of what the Milwaukee River looked and smelled like back in the late 1900s or late 1800s. And it ends on a hopeful note, with kind of remediation kind of giving us a new lease on life in our rivers. But for reasons you'll see shortly, the book I wanted to read from tonight is called Cream City Chronicles. And this came out back in 2007 and was reissued in paperback in 2015, so 5 years ago. And it is basically a series of edited columns from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel that I've done since 1994. And what happened there was the Journal-Sentinel, then it was the Journal. The Journal-Sentinel merged in 1995. But back in 1994, the Journal editorial board decided they wanted to have a feature called Our Town, and they had 4 different writers, and my beat was history. So it was an attempt to kind of bring the context of the past to bear on the present. And not less than a year later, less than a year after I began that monthly column, the 2 papers merged, and the Our Town feature went away, but the column stayed. So it's been on the first Sunday of the month for better than 25 years now. And as these are such challenging times for kind of middle market journalism, the New York Times, the LA Times, Washington Post are doing just fine, but the smaller city papers are really struggling. So the paper itself has shrunk, but the column has remained, and its focus basically is to try to provide historical context for the present, things that are going on in the present. And the reason I decided to start with Cream City Chronicles instead of the City Built on Water book is looking at the winter that we're about to face. Here we are in the middle of the first global pandemic since 1918, when the Spanish flu just swept the world and had even higher mortality. Milwaukee, relatively speaking, was kind of an oasis of kind of public health compliance and guidance as well, but still, hundreds of people died. So we're looking at Christmas in many ways. Christmas is never canceled, obviously, but there's no Handel's Messiah at the St. Joseph's Basilica. The grandkids won't be going to sit in Santa's lap. Belcano Chorus won't be performing, no candlelight services, smaller family gatherings, around our dinner tables. So we're looking at a dark time. We're looking at a time of privation, a time of isolation. It's been going on since March, and it will go on until the vaccines become available for all of us. The New York Times, I saw the feed today, said that they hope to have everyone vaccinated who wants to be, by the middle of next summer. So as one doctor said, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but we're still in the tunnel. And we're really facing that as we come into the Christmas season and Hanukkah as well. So what that really brought to mind was the experience of a set of ancestors way back in the early years of urban settlement in Milwaukee. And that the operative year there is 1835. That is when the city of Milwaukee had its first public land sale. And just try to imagine what it was like for these people coming from largely New York and New England. And they come into Milwaukee. It's a wilderness. They put up a frame home and have kind of the beginnings, the very rudimentary beginnings of a frontier society. But imagine what winter was like for them. And the point is, that our ancestors have been through this before. And the same thing that we're going through now was something that they endured back in the 1830s. So here's a column about winter at the edge of the world. By January, it had always been winter, wrote E. Annie Proulx in the Shipping News. Her novel was set in Newfoundland, but Proulx's observation translates easily to Wisconsin. Every winter, even the occasional mild one, seems to last forever. By the beginning of March, we begin to doubt that the air was ever warm, that our yards were ever green. But we've got it easy. Imagine, if you can, what winter was like for the pioneers trying to plant a city here in the 1830s. Lake Michigan was their major link with the outside world. When ice brought shipping to a halt in November, Milwaukee was beyond the reach of civilization until the following April. News was scarce, mail service was exceedingly slow, and the settlers, roughly 1,000 of them by 1837, had only each other to stare at for the next 4 or 5 months. For Solomon Juneau, the veteran fur trader who made a graceful transition to real estate, winter in the woods was business as usual. His new neighbors, most from New York and New England, found the experience unsettling. It required, first of all, as much preparation as a polar expedition. In 1836, Albert Fowler listed the provisions he had put aside before the last ship left in November. 4 barrels of flour, 100 pounds of butter, a barrel of crackers, a barrel of beef, and a large supply of potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables. A monotonous diet wasn't the only hazard of a frontier winter. Most Yankees were young men on the move, and months of enforced idleness must have been maddening. Farmers couldn't farm, developers couldn't develop, and there were very few distractions. No libraries, no televisions, no DVD players, no smartphones. It was probably a pioneer who coined the term cabin fever. There were compensations as well. Some settlers kept their hands in one of the euchre games in progress at the American House and other hotels. Some used the time to study their law books, or dig into the latest James Fenimore Cooper novel. Despite the presence of a strong temperance faction, most drank. Pioneer historian James Buck counted more than 100, quote, rum holes in frontier Milwaukee, each offering its own brand of warmth and dissipation. Hardier souls spent much of the season on the ice. The heart of Milwaukee's present downtown was a marsh that provided excellent ice skating. Benjamin Miller, an 1839 arrival, recalled the central wetlands as a winter wonderland. As he recalled in 1898, I have put on my skates at the corner of Wisconsin and Van Buren Streets and skated from there south to the old harbor mouth, a distance of nearly 2 miles. Imagine trying that today. The Milwaukee River itself was a major thoroughfare in winter. Increase Lapham, the city's pioneer scientist and a founder of the Wisconsin Historical Society, described the river in an 1836 letter to his brother. Sleighs, cutters, and jumpers are flying about in every direction. The river is frozen solid as a rock, affording the most smooth and level road imaginable. The stretch between Juneau Avenue and Water Street served as a makeshift racecourse for Milwaukee's fastest horses. A pair of New Yorkers, Elisha and Benjamin Edgerton, favored indoor entertainment. In 1836, despite a critical shortage of women, they recruited a Chicago fiddler named Joe Davlin and paid him $150 to play for a series of, quote, winter cotillion parties. Elisha Edgerton pronounced the cotillions a great success, and Davlin liked Milwaukee so much that he settled here. Navigation never resumed before the end of March, and the ice sometimes lasted into early May. By that time, Milwaukeeans must have felt as cut off from the world as a submarine crew. They were ready for new faces, new goods, and newer news.
The first ship of the season brought all that and more. It meant the resumption of life. Winter on the frontier was the human equivalent of hibernation, a time when normal concerns hung in suspended animation. We have largely conquered the season. Moving from home to car to work or school, we travel from one artificial hothouse to another. By March, however, we are as hungry for real warmth and real light as our pioneer ancestors must have been. When you begin to feel that it's always been winter, take heart. The days lengthen. So we're coming up on solstice, December 21st. The days have not gotten longer, but just got to put yourself in the shoes of those pioneers back in the 1830s and imagine the isolation they felt and kind of have some sympathy or some context, for the isolation we're feeling as well. Our ship will come in. The SS vaccine will come in and lift this siege that we've all been living under. Another kind of a seasonal favorite, and where this book came from was Michael Stevens, who was then the head of the press. He had the idea, to turn the series of columns into a book, and he very painstakingly read through all the essays from 1994 to 2006, and he was kind of the conceptual leader, but we kind of divided those into different themes: seasonal, celebrations, political, work, and so on. So it has kind of a thematic unity or thematic kind of an integrity. One comment he made early on: these are fairly short pieces, so they're to be read at one sitting. And he said, you know what room this is going to be the most read in. So I would expect that this is in a number of bathrooms around the state of Wisconsin. Want to read another one, and got time for at least one more. And this is about the traditions of eating in Wisconsin and in America as well. And the title is A Feast of Christmas Past. Between the peak colors of fall and the icy depths of winter, Wisconsinites know a fifth season, one that lasts from late November through early January. So we are there right now. I describe it as the season of too much food, capital STMF. No sooner have we stuffed the Thanksgiving turkey than we're making plans for holiday hams and roast geese, not to mention strategic stockpiles of Christmas cookies. For residents of every background, the holidays are a time of traditional plenty. Feasting, not surprisingly, is one of Milwaukee's oldest traditions. The abundance of natural resources near the lakeshore supported an Indian settlement of some importance. At least 7 villages developed within a mile or two of Milwaukee's present downtown, their residents thriving on whitefish and trout from the rivers, deer and bear from the upland forests, and wild rice from the Menominee Marsh. Menominee, in fact, means wild rice. The native tribes, including the Potawatomi, were also avid gardeners. Hundreds of acres within the present borders of Milwaukee County were used to grow corn, beans, pumpkins, and squash. It's safe to assume that there were some memorable feasts when the crops were harvested each fall. The harvest feasts were long over by early December, and most of the Indians had scattered to their winter hunting grounds. As Christmas approached, the celebrating was left to a ragtag band of fur traders who were spending the cold months here as early as the late 1600s. Milwaukee's first recorded holiday feast, or the first attempt at one, dates from Christmas of 1803. The recorder, Thomas Anderson, was a British Canadian who had spent more than 50 years on the Upper Great Lakes, first as a fur trader and then as an Indian agent. At the age of 20, Anderson had left the comforts of his parents' home in Cornwall, Ontario, for the rigors and romance of the wilderness. Those rigors the young man soon discovered included a monotonous diet, and the phrase turns up twice in 2 essays. On the month-long canoe trip from Montreal to Mackinac Island, Anderson and his men subsisted almost entirely on pea soup. Writing as delicately as he could, the trader described what he called the atmosphere hovering about his canoe, one that, quote, so affected the nasal organs that the men suffered immensely for the first few days. Scatological humor. Safely landed in Mackinac, the regional capital of the fur trade, Anderson was desperate for home cooking. Remembering the fry cakes his mother had made when he was a boy, the sojourner mixed flour with a little water and salt, cut the dough into animal shapes, and dropped them one by one into a kettle of hot tallow, animal fat. The cakes were soon so nicely browned, Anderson recalled, that his mouth, quote, fairly watered to overflowing. Appearances were deceptive, and he continues, on their touching the cold place, to my horror, the tallow became as hard as a candle. His fry cakes were, quote, tough as sole leather, forcing Anderson back to a diet of pea soup and corn chowder. Later in his career as a fur trader, Thomas Anderson discovered another backwoods treat that was something less than heart healthy, venison fried in deer fat. The results were again disappointing. He wrote, these steaks I could not eat hot enough to prevent their congealing in their progress to my throat. Consequently, the roof of my mouth would become so thickly cased over with tallow as to necessitate the use of my knife to remove it. Imagine that as a culinary visual. Anderson was clearly a bungler in the kitchen, but he tried again during his first winter in Milwaukee. Arriving near the end of 1803, he opened a trading post near what is now Jones Island. Two French Canadians, named Antoine Leclerc and Alexis Laframboise, were trading in the vicinity, but they welcomed their newest competitor. Determined to repay their hospitality, Anderson invited his neighbors to a Christmas Day feast in his three-room cabin. For the main course, he chose what he called the fattest raccoon the Indians could tree, a ring-tailed giant that weighed 32 pounds, so a good-sized specimen. The aspiring chef pounded pepper into its skin, stuffed its carcass with chopped venison, and added onions and cedar leaves for seasoning. No coon ship's body, he bragged, was ever so crammed full before. The coon was trussed up and ready for the spit by 8 o'clock on Christmas Eve, so Anderson had to ask himself, then where should it be placed for safety during the night to prevent it from freezing? Of course, by the fire. Anderson went to bed with visions of the feast to come dancing in his head. Placing his prize roast on the hearth was, as it turned out, a disastrous mistake. He wrote, but what was my mortification when I got up at daylight to hang my coon up to roast to find it putrid and stinking. Oh, misery! Sympathize with me for my lost labor and with my friends for their lost dinner. The spoiled raccoon ended Anderson's culinary career, but he apparently found enough to eat that Christmas and for the rest of his life in the wilderness. The veteran finally retired to his native Ontario, where he died in 1875 at the age of 95, despite that lard-rich, that tallow-rich diet. There have been countless early winter feasts in the 200 years since Thomas Anderson's botched banquet. They have marked holidays and holy days, but they are a response, I suspect, to a much older instinct. As solstice passes and the season of too much food continues, we emulate our ancestors in every northern clime, putting on pounds against the growing cold and the gathering darkness. So think of a putrid raccoon as you do your own holiday dinners, whether it's latkes or moving on to Christmas turkey or goose or ham. I'm going to read one more, and this is a tradition that goes back a long time in Milwaukee. I'll talk about its origin. And most cities have them, even small towns, community Christmas trees. And in Milwaukee's case, there has, for decades, over a century, there has been a ceremony following or accompanying the lighting of the tree. As always, kind of pulling the switch. I'm sure that the mayor does it, but somebody else just puts in a plug. But music and speeches and kind of celebration, bands playing, that is not happening. Did not happen this year. So another casualty of COVID, and I'm sure that's true in communities around the state. But Milwaukee is the biggest city. It's had the biggest celebration, and Capitol Square might be larger. I haven't been there for the lighting there. But I want to read the last story here about the origin of Milwaukee's Christmas tree. And it has to do with the rise of socialism in Milwaukee, which may be something of a surprise. And the hero there is a man named Amos Seidel, who was Milwaukee's first socialist mayor. He was elected back in 1910 after just a sweep. The socialists took the majority of common council offices. Victor Berger, who was the guiding light of the movement, went to Congress in the next election, the first socialist and for a long time the only, before Bernie Sanders, to be in Congress. I think Bernie was there during the last year that Victor Berger was in office. But the pattern that was established back in 1910 held Milwaukee as socialist mayors for most of the next 50 years. Dan Home was mayor from 16 to 40, and Frank Zeidler of sainted memory, was mayor from 1948 to 1960. So Amos Seidel is the guy who started the Christmas tree tradition. So I'll just read about how that started. In a relatively small but very characteristic gesture, Amos Seidel also tried to soften the socialist public image. The party had a reputation in some circles for irreligion, even atheism. No small concern in a town where the majority of voters were Catholics, Lutherans, and other devout worshipers. The reputation was not entirely undeserved. Some socialists were freethinkers in the old German mold, individualists who dismissed religion as 2 parts myth and 1 part opiate of the masses. On Christmas Day in 1888, a group of Southside socialists had attracted the media's attention by decorating a tree with a red flag and exchanging presents to mark, quote, the pagan rite of the sun. Other party faithful organized socialist Sunday schools that offer lessons in politics rather than scripture. Activities like these brought down the wrath of local church authorities. In 1911, more than a year after Seidel's victory, Archbishop Sebastian Mesmer minced no words. Socialism is a heresy and an evil, the viciousness of which is apparent to every thinking man. The immorality which socialism breeds and the dangers which it leads to can only be averted by the influence of religion. Amos Seidel was one socialist who could believe in God and the working class at the same time. Raised in a pious, even pietistic German household, he was not only comfortable with religion, but a celebrated lover of Christmas. It was Seidel who organized the Socialist Ward Unit's Christmas party every year, an event that featured a tree, carols, and gifts for every child. It was natural then that the mayor would embrace the concept of a community Christmas tree. The actual idea came from a magazine story Seidel happened upon in December 1910. It described a school teacher who put up a tree in the public square of her small town, quote, to cheer the sojourner who could not be home for Christmas. The story fired my imagination, Seidel recalled in his memoirs. Why not a community tree from Milwaukee? There must be many strangers within our gates who cannot be home for Christmas. A tree will make them feel at home. With no time for formal Common Council approval, Seidel had a tree erected in the Court of Honor at 9th Street and Wisconsin Avenue. On Christmas Eve 1910, the carillon of a nearby church rang out carols, a band played seasonal favorites, and Seidel gave what he called a Merry Christmas talk. But the star of the show, remembered the mayor, was Milwaukee's first community Christmas tree, which blazed forth in all its glory. This hastily arranged program set the precedent for what soon became a cherished annual observance. In 1916, the Municipal Christmas Tree Commission was established, a sure sign that the event had arrived. As the tradition evolved, commission members tried hard to keep it fresh. In 1930, for instance, the Christmas tree was, quote, lighted by radio from an airplane. When natural trees began to seem too small, the commission decided to build its own. Until the late 1970s, Milwaukee's tree was actually a stack of hundreds of smaller evergreens carefully arranged on a wooden frame. The tree also changed addresses more than once, moving from the Court of Honor to MacArthur Square and finally to Red Arrow Park. What did not change over the decades was the spirit that motivated Amos Seidel in the first place. Many years ago, Milwaukee's first socialist mayor put up Milwaukee's first community Christmas tree. In the 21st century, no less than in 1910, the tree stands as a light in the darkness, reminding all who pass of the promise of the first Christmas, peace on earth, goodwill to everyone. And that's my wish for you as this holiday season approaches, whatever your background or beliefs. So this is Cream City Chronicles came out in again, 2007, paperback in 2015. And what that means is that since 2007, that's 13 years of columns once a month. So 144, 154, 156, about 160 columns have been written since then. And it's my hope in the next year, I've had some very preliminary conversations with Kate Thompson about it. It's my hope that we can do a second version, a second installment of Cream City Chronicles, because there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of meat. And it's I've thought about it. Books like The Making of Milwaukee are kind of sort of a big meal. 500 pages, hundreds of illustrations. So that's, you sit down for that and spend some time. And the columns, the essays are kind history by the slice or kind of bite-sized history. History, it's a buffet, so you kind of sample the buffet. So the book's still very much in print, and my hope is that there'll be a successor coming up in the not too distant future. So looking for the chat feature here. Anything coming up there, Haley? No questions. Okay. Well, I thank you all for coming tonight. And if you're going to be watching this in a recorded format, going down the road, I hope you've enjoyed kind of this look at Milwaukee's and Wisconsin's history, from the lens of history, going back kind of at one bite-sized step at a time. So again, happy holidays to all of you. Stay safe, and the light is coming. The light is coming. Thank you.